After studying these paragraphs, I hope you would know the answers which was asked at the starting of the chapter. Like the first one, why is Mrs. Pumphrey worried about Tricky? As you have already found that she was worried about Tricky, that Tricky was unable to eat anything and he was vomiting. Second thing, what does she do to help him? Is she wise in this? So, what do you think about this? That she tried to give him over dishes, means too many dishes like chocolates, cakes, which doesn't help him. Now we will move to the next paragraph. This one we have done. Now there are some questions for you also. You have to find out these questions answer in the next from the next paragraphs. Is the narrator as rich as Tricky's mistress? First question. Second question, how does he treat the dog? Third question is, why is he tempered to keep Tricky on a permanent guest? On as a permanent guest. Number 4, why does Mrs. Pumphrey think the dog's recovery is a triumph of surgery? So you will get the answer of these questions in these following paragraphs. Now we will discuss the first one. At the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So what happens when they reached to the hospital? The household dogs, means there were too many other dogs also, they came around the Tricky, and what happens after that? The dog was looking towards them and he was motionless, means the Tricky was motionless on the carpet and other dogs was sniffing him, and they sniffed him for few seconds, and after that they thought that the Tricky is not moving anywhere and the dog is not going anywhere and he is not interested to do anything, and after that the dog used to ignore him. Now the next one, I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dog slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no meal or no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So what happens when the dog reached to the hospital? The narrator didn't give him anything except water for 2 days, and after 2 days he saw that there was a change in the habit of Tricky and he was started whimpering after hearing the sound of other dogs in the yard. Now next one, when I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe the greyhound and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. On the third day, now he also wanted to go out with other dogs. What happens next? When the narrator opened the door, Tricky quickly came out and was surrounded by Joe, who was a greyhound, means Joe is a name of greyhound, and his friends. Again, after sniffing him for a moment, all of them left for the garden where Tricky followed them. Later in the evening, the narrator was present at the dinner time and was watching all of them, especially Tristan, as he was slopping the food. As you can see in the next paragraph, what happens in the evening time? The narrator was present at the dinner time and was watching all of them, especially there was a dog whose name was Tristan, as he was slopping the food, means he was eating the food very fastly. All of them were eating with great speed because they knew that if they didn't finish quickly, then the other dog, after finishing his meal, would come to eat their meal. Means there was a competition going on between the dogs. That is why every dog was trying to eat his meal as fast as he can. Now we will move to the next page. As you can see here, it is the hospital. Okay, now next one. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So, what happens? When they had finished, Tricky looked a walk around the shining bowls, which was finished, means the food was finished by licking by the other dogs, and there was only one thing that the dog can do, that he was licking casually inside one or two bowls. And next day the narrator put an extra bowl there, and he was very pleased to see him jostling his way towards him. Jostling his way means moving fastly towards the bowl. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. That word is scrimmages. He discovered the joy of being bowled over, tramped on the quest every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the saggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtime and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. As you have seen in the previous paragraph, when everyone finished their food, Triggy went around looking at the finishing bowls and also licked a few bowls. The very next day, the narrator also put another bowl there, and the narrator was also happy to see that the dog was rushing towards the bowl. Now what happens next? Then he started getting better really quickly. Means he was getting better and better. Now what happens? He did not require any medicine and started playing with other dogs the whole day. They all used to play with each other, bump into each other. They also walk over each other and squash each other. All of the other dogs accepted him as a family member, although he was very different from others, as he was very well taken care of by his owner, by his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, and the other were not. He also used to fight for his meals with his fellow dogs, who were much larger in size than him. At night, he would also hunt rant. Sorry, he used to also hunt rats in the hen house. He was enjoying, as he had never done these kind of things before at the house of Mrs. Pumphrey. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat was according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. And there is a word, convalescing, means it is a process of recovering health. Convalescing means a process of recovering health. So what happens? All these whiles, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call more than 12 times a day to inquire about his dog Tricky. But Mr. Harriet used to avoid his questions about the coats, beds, but he only told her that the dog is in convalescing period, means the dog is recovering his health. Now next one, the word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn of the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So what happens after that? Mrs. Pumphrey used to call him regularly, dozen a time a day. After that, Mrs. Pumphrey wanted Tricky to recover fast, so she started sending 2 dozen eggs every day for him. But Mr. Harriet and his partners would have 2 eggs each for breakfast. Then, to improve the quality of blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending the bottles of wines. Means, as you can understand, Mr. Harriet was not giving anything to the dog which was provided by Mrs. Pumphrey, and they themselves, Mr. Harriet and his partner, they themselves was taking the bottles of wine and the eggs also. Then it became Mr. Harriet's habit to have 2 glasses of wine before lunch and a few along with it. So that was going to be a very happy time for them. They were enjoying the meals which was sent for the dog. And the narrator is saying that we could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge of Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire and the brandy. So Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in brandy, means he sent brandy there. At that time, Mr. Harriet was not able to believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. But the doctor was very intelligent. He did not give any brandy, any egg, or any other food item to the dog. They shared it among us themselves. Some days Mr. Harriet used to feel very happy as he would start his day with extra eggs. Then he would have few glasses of wine in the afternoon, and then ending the day with brandy in the evening. So what happens? Because of all these things that were being sent for Tricky, Mr. Harriet, as you can see, he was also getting tempted to keep him as a permanent guest. As you can see in the next one, it was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I know Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Means the things the doctor was getting, his friend was getting, it was tempting him to make the dog his permanent guest, because he was getting too many eggs and brandy, also different kinds of wine. So he thought that it would be very good to have him a permanent guest. He really wanted that Tricky should stay with them forever. But then he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey, who was like a mother to Tricky, was really suffering and really wanted Tricky to come back soon. After 15 days, Tricky was ready to go back, and Mr. Harriet called up Mrs. Pumphrey to come and pick him up. So what happens? You can see in the next one, it was a temptation to keep Tricky on on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. So Mr. Dr. Harriet called Mrs. Pumphrey to come and pick him. So what happens next? Within few minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" When Mrs. Pumphrey reached there, means when the doctor called her, what happened? Within a few minutes, a long black car came outside. When the chauffeur means a servant, opened the door of Mrs. Pumphrey's car, and Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, really nervous as well as excited. She was asking with a nervousness in her voice that was tricky, really better, to which the doctor replied positively. She wanted to ask the doctor that whether the dog is perfect or not. Then Mr. Harriet went inside to get tricky. So what happens? The doctor is saying, yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him. Now next one. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling around and around the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost bushing the ground. So what happened? When Mr. Harriet went to the garden behind the house, he saw all the dogs was moving around in the garden, and Tricky was also sitting between them. He had recovered wonderfully in these 2 weeks, around 15 days. He was looking much healthier, playing with the other dogs, and his chest was also touching the ground, means he was fit now. Now next one. I carried him back along the passes to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "oh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So what happens after that? As we already know in previous paragraph, that he was very good. He was perfect now. He has grown very well. That clear? He had discovered wonderfully in these 2 weeks, and he was now very fit and fine. He can run fast. He was looking much healthier, playing with other dogs, and his chest was touching to the ground, means he was healthy. He had become a good muscular dog within 2 weeks. When Mr. Harriet took Tricky to the front of the house, he saw that the chauffeur was still holding the door of the car, and as soon as Tricky saw his mother, means mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, he was overjoyed. He ran away and jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey and started licking her face, barking in excitement. Now what happens? During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips were trembled. So what happens? While all this was happening, the chauffeur and Mrs. Harriet got all his stuff, all the stuff of dog out of the car which had not been used. Sorry, out to the car means they took all these things which was not used in that hospital, and they took all these things in the car. And what happens after that? The stuff was not used in these days of 14 days or 15 days or fortnight. Mrs. Pumphrey was leaving. She leaned out of the window and said to Mr. Harriet with tears of joy in her eyes that she could not thank him enough for what he had done. This is a triumph of surgery, meant that the treatment that was given to Tricky was successful. So during that excitement, means the narrator is saying that he helped the chauffeur, he helped the servant to take out these things which was in the hospital, and all these things were taken into the car. And what happens after that? In the next one, the last one, "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." In that last one, she is saying that this is a triumph of surgery, means that the treatment that was given to Tricky was successful. That is the story we have completed today. There are some word meanings and there are some questions also. As you can see here, I think you have got the answer of these questions. So you will write down all these question answers in your copy. Like this one, is the narrator as rich as Tricky's mistress? Second one was, how does he treat the dog? Third one, why is he tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? Why does Mrs. Pumphrey think the dog's recovery is a triumph of surgery? So you will write down all these question answers. There will be two types of questions in your examination. Some questions will be of 2 marks and some question will be of 8 marks. So keep in mind, while you are writing your 2 marks questions, you have to write down 30 to 40 words, and while you are writing the long questions of 8 marks, you have to write down 100 to 150 words, or you can also increase that to 180 words.